The with class component here is a higher order component, but actually this way of creating it is just one of two ways of creating higher order components. So let me show you that other way as well. The other way does not work by returning a functional component here, but instead by using a regular JavaScript function, where the first argument will actually be our wrapped component, and you can name this whatever you want, but it must start with a capital character because this will actually be a reference to a component. And the second argument then is something that you need in your higher order component. And of course, that depends on which kind of higher order component you're creating and what your idea behind the higher order component could be. Here, it will be my class name, but you can use whatever you want here as an argument. And again, that really is very specific to why you are creating a higher order component. This higher order component has the purpose of adding a div with a certain CSS class around any element. And therefore, getting that class name that should be added makes a lot of sense. Of course, you can also accept as many arguments as you want based on what your higher order component does. So now here I get this wrapped component and I get this class name. In my higher order component, I then will actually return a function body in which I'll return a functional component. Okay, so now that is really strange. We have a function, and that is a normal JavaScript function, not a component function, because we're not getting props here, and we're not returning JSX, but instead I'm returning yet another function definition, and that is now the function definition of a component function. So here I'm getting props and I'm returning JSX, not yet, but soon. This here is a functional component. So in the end, I have a function that returns a function, and the function that I return is a functional component. In that functional component, I'll then add that div, where I set class name equal to class name, and the class name here refers to this argument class name I'm getting. Now inside of that div, I then output my wrapped component, and that's why we needed to have a capital W here, because this first argument I'm getting, that is expected to be a component, and that should of course therefore start with a capital character so that in our JSX code we can use it as a component. So now here I have a function that returns a functional component. How do we use this kind of higher order component? We don't use it as we do before by wrapping our component with it. Instead here, we don't wrap this, and therefore here I will actually use that hocs component now, because we don't have a root level element, but we have adjacent elements. We need that hocs component. And for this, we need to import this. So let's import hocs from hoc hocs. Now that has nothing to do with our new with class component. There, however, I can already change the name, because now I'll import that with a lowercase character. Why? Because we'll not use this as a component anymore, because, well, it isn't a component anymore. It's a normal function, a function that returns a component function, but not a component itself. I will also rename the class name here to have a lowercase character to make this really clear that in this file I have no functional component, that I have a normal function in there instead. And now in app.js, I of course need to adjust my import here too, to import from with class with a lowercase w. And then I use with class here, or I get it here. And now how do I use it? Well, you don't use it here in your JSX code. Instead here, where you export your entire app component, I now call with class. And now remember that to with class, the first argument was the component you want to wrap. So my first argument will be the app component here. The second argument then is the class name. So here that will be classes.app. Classes referring to our CS modules classes. And with that saved, as this reloads, we still have that centered style and everything. But now we're using that alternative way of using a higher order component. And that of course leads to the question, which approach should you use? And the answer is, it depends. There are higher order components, like this one actually would be, that mostly change the HTML code or change some styling. And I would argue that those best go into your JSX code as a wrapping component. So what we had before. There are other higher order components that add some behind the scenes logic, some JavaScript code that handles errors or sends analytics data or anything like that. Such higher order components maybe should be used or should be written in this style here to really make it clear that they're not so much involved in the JSX code that gets rendered, but in the logic that runs. But as you see at this example, you can ultimately write any higher order component in any way. This is a semantical thing that ultimately is up to you. Now, throughout this course, we will see multiple higher order components, not all written by us, but also some introduced by third-party packages we'll be using. And when you see them, remember what they do behind the scenes. They add something extra to the component. That could be styles, that could be HTML code, or that could be some extra JavaScript logic.